an uncomfortable conversation to talk about death, and a lot of times it seems like an uncomfortable transition from talking about health insurance, cancer insurance, Medicare supplements, Medicare Advantage, to make that connection with final expense, which seems much more of a financial endeavor. So before we get too deep into this, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Sadie to give us the rundown on housekeeping.
Yes, so as always, we have that questionnaire box. Please feel free to use it throughout the webinar. We love to interact with you guys. We love to answer questions in real time. Of course, we'll have a Q&A portion at the very end, so if you want to save your questions, that's totally fine. Or you can just ask them as we go throughout this webinar. Also, you're going to be receiving a follow-up email. This is going to have a recording in here, so if you have to hop off, that's okay. You can catch up with that recording, and then it'll also have some resources on final expense that we have, some general links to that, and you'll also be receiving a follow-up call from either our agent resources team or our outreach team. So be expecting that.
Very exciting. Again, we appreciate your guys' input, appreciate you all working with us. This is being recorded, but that does not mean that you get to jump off here and say, like, well, I'll just watch the recording later. What it does mean that is if you missed anything or had to jump into an appointment, that this will be available. So to jump into talking about final expense today, I want to make it very clear. Senior marketing specialists use final expense as an ancillary product, meaning that it is an addition to the core, which is a Medicare supplement or Medicare Advantage plan. A lot of agencies do work off of having the core product be final expense, and that's for a good reason. It's a very high commission, low servicing product, so it is kind of a flagship for a lot of carriers. We do not work that way. We use it as a cross-selling item. So that's what we're going to focus on today, talking about what is final expense, how do you talk about who's interested in it, overcoming objections, and then finally the carriers that we recommend as a company for final expense. So we'll just dive into it. First and foremost, what exactly is final expense? Final expense is a type of whole life insurance policy. Whole life meaning that as long as a consumer continues to pay their premium, they will receive the benefits of the face amount. So they're not going to time out of it due to aging out or having a term policy. They have it for 15, 30 years. There's nothing like that. As long as they pay the premium, they get the face amount of the policy. The only way, and we talked about this in the first round we did this today, the only way a person will actually age out of a out of a final expense policy is if they turn the rightful age of 120. Which is interesting. If you have a client that is plans to be, over 120 years old, final expense may not be for them. For the rest of us, though, it is an excellent option. Another thing I would say, again, we talk about final expense. Final expense is the one product a client is guaranteed to use.
That's true.
We talk about it with, when it comes to their Medicare supplements, they either are getting older and they need a Medicare product like Medicare supplements or Medicare Advantage plan, or they die trying. And then they use their final expense. Yeah. So face amounts for a final expense plan are traditionally less than $50,000. We really see anywhere between $5,000 and $25,000 on average for face amounts for these. Definitely less than $50,000. Reason for that is because these plans are truly designed for the final expenses. These aren't plans that you're going to be using to leave large lumps of money to people for a couple of different reasons. The number one primarily is that it is going to be more expensive than a traditional term insurance policy, and that's 100% for the third reason here. They are simplified underwriting. Simplified underwriting means that you're not going to have a physical, you're not having to send in blood work or urine samples. It's, can you answer the questions on this application? If yes, here's a policy for you. The way that I recommend it is on a scale of 1 to 10. The way that I talk about it, on a scale of 1 to 10, if 1 is, you have to give up your firstborn child in order to receive a policy and qualify for underwriting, and 10 is guarantee issue, can you fog this mirror? Here's a policy. On a scale of 1 to 10, final expense plans start off on around a 6. That's just because they are understanding that they're working typically with an older demographic. Typically between the ages of 60 and 80 is where you're going to see those plans, 60 to 75. So they recognize they're working with an older demographic, so they price their plans accordingly. So exactly. Anything to add on that?
Yeah, I guess maybe we can just talk a little bit about some reasons why. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here,
No,
but
please, yeah.
talk about some reasons as to why your clients might want a final expense policy. This is going to cover things. So of course, it's a separate bank account. It's a separate fund set aside specifically for those final expenses, your cremation costs, your burial costs, funeral home costs, all those sorts of things. But then also it gives your family, because really this is a policy to help benefit make it easier for your family, because you won't be around.
Right. Yeah, you won't be enjoying this policy.
Right.
Yes.
Yes. So this makes their life a little easier. It's going to cover cost of like travel. So you might have to fly home or fly family home overnight, really short notice. That can help pay for those costs. It can help pay for kind of some leftover debt. It can pay for just really any unexpected costs that come along with planning a funeral.
Exactly.
So that's why it's important.
And I think it comes across of again, we talk about client's legacy, protecting the client's legacy. When a client's loved ones think back on them, what do they want to be remembered for? Unfortunately, what ends up happening is when people look back on loved ones, they think about the process of planning their funeral, which is never an enjoyable time. A lot of times it's extreme emotional distress. You have guilt, you have anger, you have frustrations, and of course you just have this overwhelming sadness. And a lot of times there's no logic to a lot of that, and that will absolutely affect the purchasing decisions by those loved ones. And so a lot of times it's a really difficult time for those individuals. So looking back on that, the legacy is how difficult it was to plan for that funeral, to get along with other family members. If you talk to somebody who's a part of a big family, and when it comes to planning the funeral, the first thing they talk about is, well, I paid for everything, or they couldn't chip in for any of that. I had to come up, because keep in mind, this is a time frame when you are planning for a funeral. It's about a 3 to 5 day window where you're actively looking to find a way to pay for this services. Things like a traditional life insurance policy, like a term life we're talking about with those bigger face amounts, it can take weeks, if not months, to actually see a penny of benefit from those plans, compared to a final expense policy, which some of them actually don't require the death certificate at time of receiving benefits. So you are receiving a check in the mail within that same window of having to pay for these funerals. So it does allow the client to leave a legacy of ease and stress-free, and allowing the family to fully grieve versus having the family fight and argue over the funeral expenses.
Exactly.
Which is ideal. So then we're going to go into exactly what type of client should be interested in a final expense policy. And the reason for that is because there's this huge misconception that final expense is only for low income or individuals who are on Medicaid. I do understand that. I understand that misconception, because other traditional life insurance policies accrue monetary amounts, accrue, what am I trying to say? Basically value. They accrue monetary value. And when other types of insurance does that, it could potentially kick them off of Medicaid. Final expense does not accrue at the same speed or at the same value, a monetary value to that, meaning that it won't kick them off of most states' Medicaid. Always check your state's rules to make sure, but for the majority of states, that value will not kick them off of their Medicaid standing. So it is really popular for those low income people, but it's not just for them. And the reason is for exactly what we talked about earlier. I view these plans as bank accounts. They are interest accruing, because they do accrue interest. They're interest accruing bank accounts that are easily accessible in the event of someone's death. If somebody has a wealthy individual has a large sum of money set aside, a lot of times that money isn't liquidated. Something that needs to be sold or something needs to be exchanged, not as easily accessed. B, a lot of time it gets a little hairy trying to access all that money or access those assets from another individual who's not the primary person, aka the deceased. So a true final expense plan, I view it as an account that somebody has direct access to access that money quickly, specifically for those more time-sensitive things. I know, Sadie, you were talking about earlier, traveling. If you have loved ones who are living in multiple locations in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know Mike, one of the guys that we work with here, he talks about how whenever his grandpa passed away, he had to fly in that night, and we're talking hundreds and hundreds of dollars. if his family would have had something like this in place, that could have helped cover that cost.
Mm-hmm.
He needed to be there. It wasn't an option. But
And driving was going to be too slow.
Right, exactly, because they were in Vegas and he was in Kansas City, so that wasn't going to happen. They needed that plane ticket, and something like this would have covered that.
Well, and unfortunately, Mike didn't get to bring his family.
Right.
He had to go by himself
Right.
because the cost was so high, and that's something just to keep in mind. So again, it's more or less just for that. The reason for this is for that quicker turnaround, that ease of access, and again, just making sure that the legacy is left behind of making sure that the stresses that family is undergoing and the trauma is not financially related.
Right, exactly.
So going into talking about presenting final expense plans. Again, we focus on this being an ancillary product, this being a cross-selling tool. So 100%, this is how you kind of bridge the gap, because there is a gap. If you're talking to somebody who has no idea about anything insurance, which the majority of our beneficiaries and our clients don't, it is your job as their agent and as their advisor to build the connection between health insurance and life insurance. Even though they both have the word insurance in there, they don't understand.
Right.
So having that conversation, I like to do it again. I'm a full believer that 100% of cross-selling happens in the fact-finding portion of the appointment. And I'll even combine this with the warm-up, because in the warm-up portion of your appointment, you are setting the proper expectations. So before you do any fact-finding, before you ask too many questions, I like to set the standard and set the expectations of saying, Sadie, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with me today to talk. I know you're here to talk to me about your Medicare options, but my clients, I want to make sure my clients are taken care of holistically. So I'm going to be talking to you about a bunch of different things today, because I'm going to focus on building you a full comprehensive package. So we're going to be talking about, the event of you paying for you getting cancer. We're going to be talking about how you're going to help your loved ones pay for your untimely passing. We're going to be, so setting the expectation up there so that later, whenever we start asking about final expense options and I start transitioning into that, it makes sense. I told them what I was going to do, so they're not caught off guard and not feel like I'm trying to sell them something extra.
Sure, yeah. And whenever you bring it up, make sure that you're asking questions that are open-ended. So that way they don't feel trapped into the conversation.
So true.
Because if they don't want to talk about it, then they don't want to talk about it. Move on. At least you've brought it up and they know that it is something that you offer and that you can talk about whenever they're ready to. But make sure open-ended questions so that way they feel comfortable for it to be a conversation and not something that they are locked into.
Oh, for sure. And then one thing I love is on here, when you do the fact finding versus transitional phrase, it's actually a program that we've used now at Senior Marketing Specialist since 2013, I think is whenever I was first introduced to it. But it's called Legacy Safeguard. And if you all have heard of Legacy Safeguard, throw it in that questionnaire box. Be like, I've heard of it, I've used it, I've not used it, but I want to, or I have no idea what the words you were saying are. All answers are fine. Legacy Safeguard is a funeral planning service that is tied to contracts. For example, Mutual of Omaha, Transamerica Life. As long as you have one of those contracts, you do have access to Legacy Safeguard. What Legacy Safeguard is, like I said, is funeral planning service, but it's completely free for you to offer, completely free for the client to have. And it's, even if you don't write the final expense policy, let's say you write them with a Medicare supplement, you can give them this funeral planning service for free. And so it'll include things in there like a website to keep all their passwords, to keep all of their information. They can create their own picture slideshow. They can kind of have their own bio. It's a place to go to keep their legacy, a place to go to keep their memory, and a place, again, they also have what's the word I'm looking for? Funeral negotiation tools to give to the family. It's basically, in the event of your passing, it really helps you plan your funeral before it's time and allows your family a lot of that closure. Excuse me. So it is a really unique tool. The reason why it's an excellent tool for agents to have is because it is a great way to bring up the conversation of final expense. So if I was meeting with Sadie and I was talking to her again about her Medicare supplement option, I would say something along the lines of, Sadie, thank you so much for sitting down and working with me today. I know it takes a lot of trust for you to put, your health care in my hands. Just as a thank you and as a service that I give to all of my clients, I'm going to go ahead and give you this funeral planning guide. There's a whole thing that comes with the website. It's free for you to have. It's actually typically $99. My clients get it for free. which is true. If you bought it by yourself, it would be $99. My clients get it for free. But so I just want to make sure we have, all of that taken care of. Well, when we're on the topic, I want to make sure that you do have something in place for your final expenses that we can put in here. So what company do you have for your burial costs? That's just an easy, low impact way, or low, not an aggressive way of bringing up the topic of final expense, but giving them a gift. It's also a really great referral tool of saying, like, Sadie, again, thank you so much for being one of my clients. Really appreciate the trust that you put in me and my agency. I want to give you this tool that I know, you mentioned you had a big family. You mentioned that your mother is still alive. I want to give you this tool so that if you want to hand this to somebody, it's a funeral planning guide, so that you can give this to them and they can plan it, and so that you don't have to worry about planning somebody's funeral. If that's something that you're worried about with your family, if they have any questions on this legacy safeguard or how to pay for their funeral, have them give me a call. I just want to make sure that you're taken care of. So that's how we are using legacy safeguard. We've seen a lot of progress come from that. I think let's see. And Linda, sorry, I lost focus. Linda says, is that something that would be used to pre-plan your funeral? Yes, it is a funeral planning and an end-of-life planning guide for sure to help with that. I personally, again, I'm in my 20s still, very late 20s, but still, I am a legacy safeguard customer. So I have a legacy safeguard program on myself. It is really nice. It is very helpful. It keeps like where all my life insurance is, my passwords, everything like that. So I know if something did happen to me, my husband doesn't have to go through the trauma of contacting Facebook, contacting my banks. I mean, all the information is right there.
That's awesome.
Which is really nice. Yeah. Lee said he didn't find he found legacy safeguard ineffective. Perhaps it would work better face to face. Absolutely. I'd be interested, Lee, to see kind of how you're presenting it. Mine is always a gift. It's always a gift and a use it as a transition. I will mention that we do have a sister company that is a captive agency, and we asked them because we saw about 3 years ago actually it's been longer than that now. About 4 years ago, we saw a huge spike in their final expense numbers. So we just point blank asked, like, what form? What's your fact finding look like? What form are you using? What's your transitional phrase? And they said, we're just asking what company or how are they paying for their burial costs. We're just asking, who do you have for final expense? They said, we quit trying to be graceful with it and ask the questions. And they said, like, 80% of the time they made a sale just asking who is it through.
Yeah.
Which is really, really interesting. And I can tell you, doing this for as long as I have and working with final expense and working with agents who are dealing with clients, I hear a lot of objections, a lot of consumer objections to the idea of final expense, mainly because it's an unknown, that's not a word I'm looking for, an unexplained, an unknown product. It's a bit of a confusing one. It's not as well known. It's a misunderstood product,
yeah,
I would say. So I get a lot of objections to final expense, and these are just some of the more common ones that I run into. So I'm just going to kind of run through them and give some information about what exactly or why this objection isn't necessarily a good one, so to speak, when it comes to final expense. Sadie, I know you did some research on this one, but a big one I hear is, well, I plan on being cremated. It's a lot cheaper than a burial. That's what I'm going to do. So do I really need something to pay for these final expenses?
Yeah, and that's like a very common thing. I mean, whenever we think of cremation, we think of, okay, well, the cost of it. Yeah, exactly. It's the more affordable option, and it's kind of becoming more and more popular. But because it's becoming more and more popular, that means that there's going to be a spike in price. So that gap between the cost of burial versus cremation actually isn't as large as it has been in the past. I actually have the statistics here because I was looking it up for something else. Within this, so this is from 2020. So as recent as you can get on these statistics, the median cost for burial was around $7,500, a little over that.
Sure.
And then the median cost of cremation was around $5,000. So there's really not that big of a gap anymore.
Right. Yeah. And I think that would be really shocking, because I know it used to be the cost of burial was around $5,000. Now we're seeing those numbers jump up. Cremation following very quickly behind the cost of burial. Something else I think that we're seeing this year, again, we have to talk about it, what happened with COVID-19 and 2020. I think what a big thing was is unfortunate, and it is dark, and I hate to even mention it, but there was a lot of unplanned deaths this year. There was a lot of unforeseen circumstances and unplanned deaths. I imagine this is going to be much more of a sensitive topic because a lot of people probably we're seeing an increase of deaths, so a lot of increase of awareness towards it. A lot more people currently experiencing having to pay for a loved one's funeral. So it's going to be more of a top of mind conversation.
So it's funny you say that.
Oh.
Because I was also just looking up and researching stuff for the white paper that I was updating, the final expense white paper, and I have statistics on that too.
Oh.
So it said in January of 2020, 36, and this is a LIMRA. LIMRA.
I say LIMRA. It might be
LIMRA. This is a study that they did. And in January of 2020, it said 36% of Americans without life insurance said they intended to purchase it within the next year. And then by that May, so May of 2020, it jumped up to 53% of Americans expressed a heightened need for life insurance because of COVID-19. So with COVID-19 alone, it jumped up to over half of Americans without a life insurance policy said, like, I need to get it.
That's wild.
Yeah. And then it was something like 80, okay, I can't remember it. This is just off the top of my head. 80-something% of people who bought a life insurance they specifically were saying it was because of final expenses.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
So it is something that people are actively looking for. That makes sense then why our sister company just said, if you bring it up, people will buy it.
Yeah.
If you say it, they will come.
Right.
So to speak.
And it's definitely something that people are thinking of right now. So that might actually ease the whole like surprise attack.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about
something uncomfortable.
Exactly. People might already be thinking about it more than you realize.
Very receptive to that right now. Another objection is I have a prepaid plan set up with my funeral. This is extremely popular. It's seeing those prepaid plans kind of die off, but you will come across people that are currently in prepaid plans and think that they're covered. My number one thing, and I'd say you brought some excellent points up earlier that I want you to cover, but my number one thing with prepaid plans is that you paid for that funeral based on what the costs were at the time of setting that up. Inflation, and as we're seeing in the numbers that you talked about for cremation, inflation has happened hard. It's really hit our economy. So what $3,000, $5,000 paid for 5-10 years ago, it's going to be a fraction of what it pays for today. So making sure they have something that actually covers the cost of their funeral.
Yeah, absolutely. And then even on top of that, if you do that prepaid funeral sort of thing, that's not going to cover all the unexpected costs that come with it. That's probably not going to cover travel costs and stuff like that. Most
Hospital
likely.
bills, things like that. True costs of the final expenses.
Exactly. And not to mention, actually, an agent that was on the webinar earlier, she brought up a good point that the funeral home is a beneficiary, is listed as beneficiary on there, correct? Is that what she said?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's also not ideal.
Not great.
Yeah.
So keeping that in mind. The next one is, again, we've kind of talked about this, but somebody's saying, I have life insurance. I don't need a separate final expense. I have life insurance. My biggest thing with that was life insurance typically will have a longer turnaround time. It can take months to receive that benefit because a lot more goes into a traditional larger face amount life insurance policy. Obviously, it takes a lot more to get those approved. So you're not, again, when you have that 3 to 5 month window, 3 to 5 day window, life insurance policy isn't going to satisfy that need.
Linda actually has a good question here. She said, prepaid funeral pricing will go up. Aren't you locked into a contract price at the time?
It depends on what it is.
Okay.
A lot of pre-planned funeral will have riders that allow for inflation, depending on what that is. But the ones that we've had experience with do not have a contract locked in for that service.
Interesting.
So,
good question.
So it's reading the fine print, and the experience that I have is mostly an additional rider for the inflation protection if you go directly to that funeral home. So keeping that in mind. But like Sadie mentioned earlier, even if they do have that inflation protection rider, it's going to be things like that money is going to the funeral home. It's not going to cover medical costs. It's not going to cover travel expenses. It's not going to cover credit card debts or anything like that. It's locked into using with that funeral.
Yeah.
So And the last but not least is one is probably I hear the most is that I'm leaving behind a healthy inheritance or a hefty inheritance. Why would I need something to pay for my final expense? I hear this like, if my family can't pay for my funeral with my own money, then like shame on them, you know?
Right.
And I hear that a lot of being like, I'm leaving them enough, they're fine. Again, coming around the fact a lot of the inheritance is not liquid. It's a lot caught up in land, caught up in real estate, caught up in others, you know, in accounts and investments. So a lot of it's not as liquid. A lot of it, and again, I think it's about what legacy do you want to leave? Do you want that inheritance to be used for your family and your remembrance and your legacy? Or do you want them to use that inheritance for, again, paying for your funeral? More importantly, what we're seeing right now is, can people afford your inheritance? This is something that's been a huge topic lately, is that because you get an inheritance, typically what follows that is a pretty hefty tax that comes with those inheritances. Unfortunately, especially when it comes to inheritance of land and inheritance of real estate, when that is handed down family member to family member, generation to generation, we're seeing that a lot of people can afford to keep it because of the taxes that come with it. So those final expenses, because they are very quick turnaround, those final expense benefits can be used to help offset the cost of taxation on those inheritances.
Yeah, I actually feel like recently I saw something about how the boomer generation is a generation that won't be leaving behind too much of inheritances anyway, because of, well, they are one generation that is growing the most in student debt because they're paying for their children, which is very interesting. But so inheritances might not even be as much as a thing as we move through time, I guess.
No, that's very true. That's actually a study that was done, I believe by Deft Research. They were talking about how the baby boomer generation is very unique, about how they own 70% of the disposable income in the United States. However, a lot of that, again, they're the first generation to be less cognizant and less worried about leaving behind an inheritance. Because of their hard work towards it and whatnot, and their children and being well off, and what, there's a lot that goes into it.
Sure.
But yeah, that is something that they're recently finding out. So very good point. So now comes the big question, the technical question of, I understand I want final expense. What companies do we recommend? So we recommend, when it comes to shopping for final expense, number one, typically people lean towards price. I want to make it very clear. If you look at like the most competitive price final expense versus like the 10th most competitive final expense price wise, you're looking at like a $5 difference. All of them are very, like the top one and top two may be pennies different. So price has very little to do when it comes to shopping final expense, which seems counterintuitive for a lot of the products that we offer. So what it comes down to, there's three things. Number one is going to be underwriting. Each company has their own niche. One company may look at diabetes and retinopathy and be like, that's completely fine. Another company may say, nope, we will not accept that. So you have to look at the underwriting. Number two is branding. Whenever you're purchasing final expense, you're purchasing a promise because you personally are not going to be using that policy. So branding, brand recognition, and trust is huge. So having a brand name carrier is very, very helpful when it comes to final expense. And number three is customer service, making sure customer and agent services, making sure that they can trust that company to whenever that comes down to time, they're going to work with their family members as far as getting that policy paid out as soon as possible. We recommend these three carriers. Sadie, tell us a little bit about Ascendo through Aetna.
Yes, so Ascendo is a really cool, unique product, and it's actually one that hits all three of those things. First thing, not only does it have the Aetna name tied to it, which is already a big name in itself, it has the CVS name tied to it as the parent company. So I saw a statistic that said 70% of Americans live within 3 miles of a CVS. 70%.
That's wild to me.
Yes.
That's so wild.
It's insane. So it's most definitely a household name, and with something that's pretty uncomfortable, you'd be surprised how even like a brand name can feel, make it feel a little less.
It's trust.
Exactly.
I know them. I've had coffee with CVS. I get it.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. So has that brand name. Kind of doubles down on that brand name there. And then also it has this really cool thing called super preferred rating. So basically what this is for the clients who qualify and have an underwritten Aetna Medicare supplement, they can get an 10% discount off of that preferred rate. And then of course you as the agent still get paid on that full preferred rate, but the client's going to get a 10% discount, which I think is pretty cool.
Oh, for sure. It builds that loyalty, builds that credibility of like, and kind of makes your job easier as the agent to know like your coverage is Aetna, your MedSup, maybe your PDP, your final expense, your cancer, your home health care. Aetna is by far like one of my favorite ancillary companies. So huge there.
Yeah. Also, not to mention that the underwriting is decently lenient compared to other companies. Some of its competitors. I won't get too much into that. You kind of talk with that with our outreach team and whatnot. But also they have a really good e-app, and the e-app has instant decision, which obviously is something that, it's huge in the preferred way.
Well, instant decision, because final expense is something you want to be very careful not to cause buyer's remorse. And buyer's remorse happens whenever there's unsure or uneasy about the decision. And so whenever there is a long turnaround time for underwriting, it leaves a lot of that in the air. And that's where buyer's remorse tends to creep in. That's where you as the agent gets chargebacks. So anything that has that instant issue option is going to really alleviate what could potentially be a problem with buyer's remorse.
For sure. Yeah.
Susan asked, did you say that the MedSup has to be underwritten? Okay. So the MedSup does have to be underwritten for you to get that super preferred rate for the final expense?
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay. The second company that we recommend is United of Omaha for a lot of the same reasons, actually almost all of the same reasons as we do for Aetna Ascendo. Great brand name, having that Mutual of Omaha brand and logo, and of course working with United Kingdom for years, huge, holds a lot of weight for sure. They do have different, preferred versus standard rates, and their underwriting is relatively easy. They're going to be up there in pricing as well. So I would say Ascendo and United of Omaha, two birds on the same branch, so to speak. They work the exact same way. Gerber Life Insurance is going to be a different style of product. Gerber Life Insurance is something I 100% recommend you have to have because it is considered a guaranteed issue plan. Unfortunately, a lot of times when a person comes into your office or you're in their home and they're asking specifically about life insurance, more times than not, it's because something happened and they need life insurance. I can't tell you how many agents that I've talked to that they'll have somebody come into their office and say, I was just diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. What can I do with life insurance? And at that point, for the traditional companies, it's too late. They don't qualify through underwriting. Right. It's wonderful to have a guarantee issue option. Now, a guarantee issue option isn't the go-to, mainly because it's going to be much more expensive than the traditional underwritten plans. Now, Gerber, I recommend them. Again, they're actually partners with United of Omaha. They work together. I believe they're reinsured by United of Omaha, but they have a huge brand name for Gerber, which is huge, again, having that really trusted name. Plus, they are really unique in how they pay. In the first 2 years a person has that policy, if they pass away within the first 2 years, they get like 110% of their premiums. So basically, it's like a high investment loan, high investment payments those first 2 years. After those first 2 years, they do get the full face amount, which is very unique. So I do really like Gerber. They are also, as far as we have several different guarantee issue options, Gerber is by far the cheapest because it does matter. Guarantee issue price does become a situation. So Lee was asking if any other carriers that senior marketing specialist represents has any options for like a 10 pay or a limited pay option. So again, I would, Transamerica is really the only company that we have that has that option. I would pay attention. I think United, actually I say that United Home Life does as well. They're not on this list. They are, they work just as well as Aetna and United of Omaha. They're just not well known as a brand, but they do have a 10 pay option that I would recommend. Anybody beyond that, I would recommend working with their partners over at Crump Financial Services. Crump works and specializes in all types of life insurance, whole life, universal life, term life. They also specialize in long-term care as well and annuities. So we refer anything in addition to traditional final expense, we typically refer and recommend working with Crump. So yeah, and I know Lee, you asked if SMS, so we have an instant approval with a phone call. I guess, again, like we're not the ones who would be able to make an underwriting decision, but again, like we talked about, Aetna does have that instant issue with their e-application. So great questions.
Yeah.
So this is who we recommend. Again, what I do recommend is having at least 2 carriers, 1 guarantee issue, and then either Ascendo or United of Omaha. And again, just making sure that whenever you're shopping final expense plans, that you're paying specific attention to the underwriting, because that's really what's going to be the differentiation between Aetna and United of Omaha. So guys, here we are. Any questions, comments, concerns, threats, or promises when it comes to final expense or just the senior demographic or senior insurance in general? Again, final expense is one that I'm not going to say it's an easy sale, but the numbers don't lie. 53% of people are actively looking for final expense in particular, which is wild. So making sure, again, over half your clients want this. So making sure they're not buying it from you guys, they're buying it from somebody, making sure you're having that conversation. Yeah. I'll also add that final expense is I mentioned it earlier today, but it is very limited on the servicing. Once people don't typically shop final expense, once they have it kind of checked off their mark, they're done. They want to, they're not going to shop yearly for final expense, and so the servicing isn't bad. And you're also going to only have to service the final expense policy once, and that's when you're working with the family of the deceased client. So, and it's also, again, very, very high commissions. Year 1, years 2 and beyond are next to no commissions, again, for the simple fact that there is very little servicing involved. So great product if you want to pad your wallets and pad your bank accounts. That makes a huge difference in your clients and provides a lot of value. Final expense is the way to go.
Yeah, absolutely.
Susan, can we get underwriting information from senior marketing specialists? Susan, absolutely. 2 ways you can do that. One is work with our agent resources team and let them know, hey, I have a client with these conditions. What plans do you recommend? That is something we will always be happy to work with you and give you recommendations on carriers that will look at those clients healthy. Or you can use the CSG quote engine on our CSG quote engine on our website. There is an underwriting tab there. You type in the client's conditions and it'll pull up final expense companies and let you know in their underwriting guides how they view that, look back periods, if it's a standard or level rate, things like that. So you have us or you have the internet, both tools offered by senior marketing specialists. Yeah, so Lee was asking, can you recommend finding leads through direct mail or Facebook leads? Lee, let me ask you this. Are you talking, before I answer that, I want to know, are you talking in general for the Medicare market, or are you talking specifically for final expense? Because my answer would be different depending on which one you're looking for, so let me know. Okay, he says specifically for final expense. So yes, if you're trying to find leads for final expense, we do work with a couple of different carriers. One that we do a lot of final expense leads and have that conversation through is Lead Concepts. They do have a really fantastic final expense mailer that works really well specifically for that content. It works really well. It's actually, you get a pretty decent rate of return for mailers. Facebook is a different conversation. Facebook, there isn't a ton of studies done on doing final expense leads through Facebook because it's a pretty dark conversation for a social media platform.
Right.
So it doesn't work as well as something like cancer insurance or Medicare insurance or things like that because it's just it doesn't translate well to social media.
It's a heavier conversation.
It is. So it doesn't just, for internet and social media, it doesn't translate. If you are interested in looking specifically for final expense leads, we recommend Secure Agent Leads when it comes to social media. They do have different things that they work with. They do use social media as well as other internet avenues. That's who I tend to lead towards. If you want discounts on both Lead Concepts and Secure Agent Network, go to smsteam.net, click on the services tab, scroll down to our leads page, and we have a lot of information about how to access the discounts because you are an SMS agent. Let's see. Nicole was asking, does the premium stay the same forever? Depends on the carrier. Some carriers will have attained age, meaning that the older the client gets, the higher the premiums go up. Others, like Gerber, will say issue age. The premium will not go up because of your age. I don't remember off the top of my head what Aetna and United of Omaha is. Great question to ask our outreach team. They'll be able to tell you if it is attained age or issue age. That's not state specific, it's carrier specific, not Pacific like the ocean. Lee was asking, can we explain the relationship that senior marketing specialist has with Crump? Absolutely, Lee. Senior marketing specialist, we focus on senior insurance. We focus not so much on the financial side because between Medicare supplements, Advantage plans, all the ancillary products, that's a lot of knowledge to have and a lot of expertise that we offer. When there is an area that we can't give that same level of service, we can't give that same level of expertise, we're not going to, I think the best way I can explain it, we're not going to be a fish trying to climb a tree. We're going to make sure we find the right people to service you the same way that we would service our Medicare business. And so that's why we vetted a ton of different organizations. That's why we decided to work with Crump. Crump focuses exclusively on their financial. So again, with the relationship with Crump, they have a two-way option. You can either contract directly with Crump when it comes to these financial products like term and universal life insurance, annuities, long-term care plans. You can work with them directly on that. Or they have a cool referral program. If you refer the clients over, you get 50% of the commissions without having to do any of the work. So it's a cool program. They do have a lot of white glove service. We've worked with them for 3 years now and have had nothing but positive experiences with them, which is why we continue to go back and use them. We use them ourselves. Let's see. Lindsay. Okay, sorry, I've lost focus. Lindsay, what would you say to clients who are wanting more than a $50,000 for final expense? How can you combat that objection? Great question, Lindsay. 100%. And again, there are options. I know we said that Aetna does go up to 100,000, wasn't it?
Aetna goes up to 50,000.
Goes up to 50.
Yeah.
Honestly, Lindsay, my number one thing is if you're wanting a true final expense policy, $50,000 face amounts are gonna be extremely expensive. It doesn't take very long for a person to pay the premium for a final expense for $50,000 for it to equal what that face amount is. So that's why I don't, typically recommend them that high, just because the premium does increase dramatically. And once you kind of explain that to them, that like it really doesn't make financial sense to go that high, the premiums will end up outpaying the benefit. It's a pretty easy to understand like why we don't see that being an option very much. It's just a very expensive plan. It happens. I've seen them written. I just don't understand it.
Yeah.
Carol asked, what about a group life product? Who do you suggest? So again, when it comes to group, you're talking specifically, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Carol, about underage employer benefits, employer life insurance when it comes to group insurance. I don't have any knowledge of that. I specialize in the senior market on the individual side, not so much the group side, so I don't have knowledge of that. No, I don't believe any of the carriers that we recommend or are contracted with support the group sales. So I'm sorry, I'm not. I will be more than happy to tell you when I am uneducated on something. I am uneducated on that. I will not give advice when I don't know the information. You're welcome, Nicole. And you're welcome, Carol. See, I'm honest. I don't have that big of an ego. I can say when I don't know something. Glinda was like, are you talking about Crump or Crump and Foster? We're talking about Crump, C-R-U-M-P, Crump Financial. There's information about Crump on our website, smsteam.net. There is a form on there that you can fill out to either get contracted directly with Crump, or there's an information for you to submit your client's information to receive half of the commissions that Crump makes. Amy, I think I've answered all of the questions. I know we got a bunch in at once, so thank you guys. I love the interaction. I believe we answered all of those questions. If I didn't, please retype them because I kind of got lost. But any other questions or comments in regards to final expense, guys? And again, I do really appreciate the interaction. It lets me know, again, this is your time. This is your information that you're looking for. So I want to make sure we're making the absolute most out of that for sure.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts, Sadie?
I don't have any.
Perfect. Well, again, guys, if you do have questions, feel free to reach out to us. We do have additional training on our university. Sadie is going to be sending out an email with the recorded webinar as well as our white paper that we have for more information and training on final expense. So looking forward. Yes, you too, Nicole. Thank you. Looking forward to having conversations with you guys. If you do need anything, feel free to reach out to myself or Sadie. Our number is there on the screen. We're the only Olivia and Sadie here at the office, so feel free just to call, ask for us, 1-800-689-2800, or you can email me at olivia.richardson@smsteam.net or sadie.frazier@smsteam.net. So you all have a wonderful day. Thank you again.